what I'd like to think about, because raiding is very close to my heart in this game, in fact it's basically the reason I play, is what will raid balance, what will the raid pressures be in Legion, knowing what we know now, okay, which is quite limited. Now I'm going to sort of go over obviously tanks, healers and DPS, the roles in raiding. Now tanks, we've had a bit of trouble, I would say, over the recent years, because we have a number of tanks, and what do we need? We need 2 in a roster. Your ideal tank is someone who's going to be there all the time. Yes, you can have a DPS. If you're lucky enough to have a DPS who can play tank on a very irregular basis, then that's great. But you want 2 dedicated tanks. Also, ideally, those tanks will be able to play other classes and have those tanking classes, and maybe your guild will help gear them up so that they can be used when necessary. But that's quite rare. That doesn't often happen. And the problem then is, because all the tanks work very differently, you can have situations where one raid group gets past a particular boss much more easily just because of the tanks they happen to have. Examples of this are towards the end of Blackrock Foundry. Non-shield tanks were particularly good on Iron Maidens and Blackhand. So if you were in a situation as we were, where our 2 main tanks were both shield tanks, a paladin and a warrior, we were struggling on Iron Maidens. Yes, you can do it. We could have done it. But one of our tanks had a brewmaster. Once it was geared up, we used that, trivialized the last boat, I should say, completely, the Admiral Garand boat, and so much easier. And if we'd have had that from the start, we'd have done it so much quicker. Same with Blackhand, non-shield tank, brewmaster particularly good at it, but a non-shield tank to face tank the siege engines helped on Blackhand immeasurably. So you could save weeks of progress just by happening to have the right tanks. And it's not like there was an obvious combination of tanks and your guild was silly if you didn't have that combination. You should be able to have any 2 tanks and they should be able to cope with it. But we come to the problem of homogenization, don't we? We can't have all the tanks behave the same way. But when you developed it, and the whole point, remember, of going to a single raid size for the hardest mode was specifically so that Blizzard could design interesting mechanics where they didn't have to worry, oh, will they have this particular class? Oh, we can't do it then because a 10-man guild might not have that class. But the problem is that even a 20-man raid roster, which might have maybe 26, 27 in it, maybe not even that, still might not have everything covered. You cannot have all the tanks there are. And in Legion, there's going to be another one. There's going to be Demon Hunters. And I'd be willing to bet Demon Hunters will not be essential, but I bet you they will be strong on a number of fights, because the new class, they usually, I would say, develop mechanics on some bosses, not all, but in some, that favour having that class in that role and all the roles it can play. So this is DPS and tanking in the case of Demon Hunters. So I think if you don't have access to a Demon Hunter tank, there will be some fights that will be more difficult. And it's just an extra tank class. I mean, what we're going to have now, we're going to have warriors, paladins, death knights, druids, monks, and now demon hunters, 6 tanking classes. So that's going to put a bit of pressure on raids, either to come up with very cunning strategies if you don't have that particular tanking class, or for DPSers to be able to step up and play that tanking class. But that means making sure they're geared for tanking, and also giving them a bit of practice, so they can actually practice tanking. Healing potentially could look a bit brighter, because at the moment one of the big problems is the absorption issue. Disciplined priests putting shields on everyone, which is absolutely brilliant. I mean, absorbing damage is brilliant. You know, let's say you take a load of damage and it's going to do 80% of your health damage. And other healers might be able to heal that up. Okay, no problem. But let's say very shortly after you take another hit of damage and that wipes you out, it kills you. Oh, dead. But let's say you have a shield that will shield you for 50% of your damage. That 80% damage now only does 30%, and you've got plenty of health. The healers have got more time to heal you up. So, shields have been obligatory. It has been obligatory, really, to have a discipline priest. Even Blizzard said if you've got a priest, just one priest in your healing roster, they're going to be discipline. Even though there's nothing wrong with Holy. Holy have been conspicuous by their absence. The archetypal healer in World of Warcraft is absent. I'm not saying no guilds have Holy priests. Some do. But they are, in Mythic raid rosters, pretty rare. Because again, 5 healing classes, you generally don't have more than 5 healers in your roster, because most fights only need about 4. It's 4, give or take 1. Some fights you use 3 on progress. This is some fights you might even need all 5. Usually it's about 4. So it doesn't really give you a lot of scope for taking multiple of healing classes, and if you do, it means you're probably missing something in your healing roster. But they're changing that, so discipline priests aren't going to be at the absorbs now. It's going to be much more of healing, and the way they're going to distinguish that from the holy priest is it's almost like going back to the atonement. You're going to generate your healing from 50% normal healing, 50% damage, like atonement type thing, but with the heal targeted on a player rather than smart heals just flying around all over the place. Now, again, that could add pressures of its own. Will the current discipline priest, because it'll be a totally different playstyle, will they still want to play that? If not, are there going to be enough people taking up playing a healing priest to cover for that? Who knows? But at least it means you're not in a situation like we are now, where you must have a discipline priest, but you don't really want to. Again, some people do take 2 and are successful with 2, but it's very rare. You usually want 1, and you want 1 who will be there every raid, because if they're not, you're going to suffer. But if you have 2 priests, again, don't really want 2 disc priests. And again, holy, if you have a holy priest and a disc priest, and the holy can go disc, if the other disc is absent, then it probably means you're doing without a particular healing class in your roster as well, because you'll just have too many healers otherwise. But that being said, it is looking a bit brighter for healers, at least, in that you might not have one healer who is absolutely vital, because it can still happen. I mean, it is really annoying on progress if the healing class that's really strong on that fight is then absent on the night you want to do progress on that boss. And then you're faced with choices. You can either not do that boss. If you've got another option, then great. If not, then you're scuppered. Or you can do the night's progress anyway, find that you make no progress whatsoever and just wasted your time because you really needed that healer. Now, DPS is going to change a lot, particularly melee DPS. Now, the situation we have at the moment, of course, is that there are already more melee classes than ranged classes. In terms of the classes that can only play ranged DPS, you've got 3. And that is the casters, specifically the clothies. Priest, mage, warlock. That's it. We currently have 2 classes that can have a foot in both camps. Enhancement shamans or elemental shamans, or you can have feral druids or balanced druids. Okay, but they need different gear sets. Hunters are coming into the mix. Now, hunters will actually potentially put a lot of pressure on, because they will have so much advantage as far as I can tell, because you can have your Beastmaster Hunter that is essentially a melee, but on a fight where, say, melee are about as welcome as a fart in a spacesuit, for example, Blackhand, Tyrant Velhari, these sort of fights, they can just say, okay, well, I'll just switch to marksman or survival spec and go ranged. And largely with the same gear. Now, like with any DPS spec, I mean, in Legion, you're going to need a different weapon because your artifacts can be different. But they have said, although they're not going to really allow catch-up for alts, they are going to put into place, they haven't said what yet, but they are going to put into place some way of you being able to keep up to a certain extent with artifacts for your other specs, which they're going to need to do. And actually, by the time Legion actually comes out, they may well just go the whole hog and say, do you know what? All your artifacts for the same character will level up at the same rate. Because I don't see any other way around that. So it might be no disadvantage at all. You could use exactly the same gear and you get your artifact for your weapon anyway, because you don't need weapons to drop. So you don't have to worry about having a better Beastmaster weapon than like a ranged weapon and therefore being stuck as a melee player because your gear is better. Yes, different specs even for the same class. You need secondary stats have different values. But other than that, I mean, you're still going to be using the same primary stat. So I would think, unless they do something very different, the same basic gear and trinkets that will be good for marksman will also be at least decent for Beastmaster and vice versa. Now that puts pressure on the melee roster because you have a player who can presumably will be competitive in melee damage, but has the option of going ranged if necessary. And then, of course, we have an extra melee class, which is the Demon Hunter. And like I said before, they're not going to let this be weak. In the expansion in which a class is new, the new guy is supported well. And they may even have utility that will be invaluable on some fights. So there's going to be, blimey, what's there going to be now? 9 melee classes out of the 12. 6 of which can only play melee. They have no option. If they're going to be DPS, they're melee DPS. There is no way around it. Unless Paladins get shockered in. Don't think we will, though. And 3, as I say, that can have a foot in both camps. But, you know, Shamans and Druids need completely different sets. Completely different primary stats needed for the ranged and DPS. For the ranged and melee, sorry. Whereas Hunters, yeah, it'll still be agility either way, won't it? So, yeah. And then what we think to ourselves is, okay, so why is it a big issue? Because if you have loads and loads of range and not many melee, usually you're okay. What is it that melee actually bring to the table? Well, we have short duration interrupts. So interrupt rotations are very easy to do with plenty of melee. What else do we bring? If the boss is being dragged around a lot, we don't really suffer from movement. As long as the movement is predictable and not too fast, then we can generally maintain high DPS whilst on the move. But where do we struggle? Well, boss-centered AoE effects we struggle on. And this has been the case for a long... This isn't just recent. As far back as Molten Core, this was an issue. But back then, the only real melee you had were rogues. And then warriors when they weren't needed to tank on a particular boss. Other than that, there wasn't a great deal. You had paladins keeping judgments up. That was about it. But yeah, boss-centered AoE effects, which could be like fears, as was the case on Magmadar and Molten Core. AoE damage effects, like on Golemag towards the end when he was nearly going to die. And the effect of these things are, when these happen, it means either your melee have to move out of range, in which case they're not doing DPS, or they need extra healing or some other consideration, which again is draining resources. Other things that are problematic with melee, lots of melee, are player-centered AoE, especially that does splash damage. So here we have things like in TBC had Illidan, where you had to all spread out again, move away from being able to... You couldn't do DPS at that point because you couldn't stand on each other. Tyrant Valhari with the Infernal Tempest. Again, lots of melee. It's doable with lots of melee. I've done it with like 7 or 8 melee there, but it's much tighter and you've got to be on your toes. It's certainly not ideal. So, you know, ones where you get AoE effects that will center on a player and will do splash damage particularly are a problem for having lots of melee. And the other thing is, if there is, which there hasn't been, I think, recently, I can't think of an example of this recently, but it could exist, where you have to rapidly change targets which may not be close together. That is often an issue for melee, because moving between them, if you have to do it quite regularly, it means you're losing a lot of DPS then as well. So what we have to think to ourselves is, okay, so in Legion, are they going to get rid of these sort of mechanics? No. They've deliberately got the set hard mode, Mythic, raid size, because they want to be free to bring in whatever mechanics seem interesting. So melee classes basically need two features in order to be strong as a roster choice. They need defensive abilities that allow them to negate some of the worst effects of the things that cause us so much trouble. So that will be speed boosts for getting between different targets. That will be defensives that can negate a certain amount of damage. So rogues, for example, with feint. You also you want some sort of raid-wide utility is also ideal, because it's a reason to bring you along. This piece of utility that makes it really useful. Death Knight's grip, for example, is obligatory on some fights. Rogue's smoke bomb is useful. Warrior's rallying cry, all these sort of things. So then if you don't have those, or worse still, if you don't have either the defensives or the utility, then there's going to be a lot of pressure. Because let's face facts, you're not going to have one of each melee class in your raid roster, because for some you take multiple. Like, you will often want 2 Death Knights because 1 grip often isn't enough because of the cooldown on it. You will usually want 2 or 3 rogues because, well, rogues. So even if you don't take 2 of anything else, even having 1 of everything else is going to mean that's too large a melee roster. So there's going to be a huge pressure on it. And obviously, until we see exactly how the abilities are playing out, we won't know exactly what this means. Because ideally, we would like to think there's just parity, and you just have to recruit in your guild the best players you can, and they play whatever they play. But the override, and of course that will be part of Blizzard's design philosophy as well. What are the best? Bring the player, not the class. But the overriding design philosophy often seems to be about avoiding homogenization. Some will already argue there is some homogenization. For example, all melee have got interrupts, and mostly it's on a 15-second cooldown. Shamans get it on 12. We don't know about demon hunters. We can be quite sure they'll get an interrupt of some kind, though. But yeah, shamans have the advantage. It's a ranged interrupt, 12 seconds. Much better. But all melee get a short duration interrupt. Beyond that, they do play very differently, and Blizzard will obviously want to avoid homogenization. But if you avoid homogenization as your overriding design philosophy, it means on some fights, some classes are just going to be better than others. And the classes that are usually going to be strongest are the ones, as always, that have access to multiple DPS specs. So rogues will always be strong in melee because they have access to 3 DPS specs, unlike the other melee classes. Demon hunters will be interesting because they only get 1, much like paladins and monks in melee and priests in range. I suppose hunters in melee, because hunters still have another DPS spec without having to change too much. And so that will be interesting. So in future, expansions, they might not be all that brilliant. But as I say, they'll never let the new kid on the block be weak. They will always support the new spec. So demon hunters will be strong. So yeah, so those are my thoughts on sort of raid roster pressure. And it will be interesting to see when betas start going out and we start to get a bit more information, and especially as we get closer towards Legion, how it is going to pan out. And it will very much depend on what do each of those classes bring to the table. Because if a small number of classes bring a lot more to the table, you're obviously going to want to double or even triple up on those and do without others. But yeah. But anyway, that's it from me for now. Back next weekend with some more thoughts for what might happen in Legion. It's probably another raid-themed one. But until then, see you later.